All right. I really, really hope I get this right. I've been thinking about it a lot. I have such limited time right now. Pretty much got very little time. I'm still working on some things I've been promising in the past, and plan on continuing to do that. But I've been doing some reading and thought, well, I'll just bring as much of this to you from my mind as I possibly can. All right, now with that out of the way, I'm trying to keep my introductions really short from now on, if I have them at all. um, so I will offer you the texts I've been reading out of. The first is the Manchester's Lectures in Philosophy. There will be links in the descriptions for all this. This is excellent text where they're responding to really the life and career of some of the things that Peter Van Inwagen has been dealing with. It's excellent text. Now, I want to warn you ahead of time. If you have no philosophical training, this book's not for you. The whole point of this video is to make some of these very complex ideas more plain and bring them to more people that might run across this on YouTube. Because there's a lot of really good advanced philosophy out there, but unfortunately, not all of it's easy to understand without some formal education. So I have found through living it out, I have my feet in multiple waters. I have in these two worlds, one in the academic world and one in the average person's world. And when I take these ideas and bring them to your average person, they tend to really enjoy them. They really love them. In fact, many of them ask me what some introductory books in philosophy they can buy. They're never going to do philosophy, but they want to know more. And I'm more than willing to buy the books for them. And so, but in case you're one of those people or you're somebody really interested in this, you definitely want to do more introductory texts. And so the name Peter Van Inwagen is not synonymous with introductory text, to be sure. And these Munster Lectures, this is the fourth of several of them, I suppose. I have not read any others, but I'm going to. What they're attempting to do is take with Van Inwagen's cooperation, some of his ideas, and then they're responding to them, his opponents, and then he does a response to their responses in the end. Highly recommend this, especially if you're into metaphysics or ontology. Really, really good stuff. The other book I'm offering here is Material Beings. Again, link will be in the description on this. Again, you want some training before you read something like this. I think if you've taken introductory courses in philosophy, you'll still have to look up terms, but if you've kept your books, you can look up some of the language in that, and it'll be there, and you can Google some of it. If you have the training, it shouldn't be too hard to be able to do that. And finally, the most complex book is the Dungeon Master's Guide from 1979. Very complex text. You know what? In fact, it's so complicated, I'm not even going to include it. I've been saving that since I was a kid in hopes that it would be worth money one day, and now it's finally met its only purpose as a prop. The Gollyswoggle. What is the Gollyswoggle? Well, let's take this back a little bit. There's a puzzle of Theseus. Now, the puzzle of Theseus is pretty interesting, and it asks an interesting question. Let's say you took a ship. Theseus had a ship, and it was put into a museum. And over eons and eons, the wood in the ship was rotting away and being replaced. And at some point, and they stored the wood away that was rotting. And at some point, all of the wood on the ship was replaced. And some aliens came down with some technology, because we all know that aliens would be very objective compared to us. I'll make a video on that another time. I think, what would aliens think if they saw us? I have some things to say about that eventually. But they come in and they go in and they have a fabricator that can restore the rotting wood to its original composition. And so they do that and they remake the ship of Theseus. And so the question is, which ship is the ship of Theseus? Now, some people would say, well, the original ship is the ship of Theseus. And other people would come along and say, well, no, actually, the original would rather. The one we've been calling the ship of Theseus is the ship of Theseus. Right? And then others would go Hegelian on it and say, well, no, actually, they're both the ship of Theseus. Now, I know that Peter Van Inwagen was highly influenced by Quine, and I'm not sure if this would be what Quine would say, but I do know it's what Peter Van Inwagen would say. He would, of course, come along and say, I've got great news. Neither are the ship of Theseus, because there never was a ship of Theseus. Plot twist. Peter Van Inwagen doesn't believe that things exist. No, that's not exactly what he means. He's getting into something much hairier, much dicier than that, but something I think is really interesting. So let me back it up a little bit and see if I can make this easy to understand. What you have is there's a group of people, group of philosophers that think that it's very important that things that we notice in the world, like tables and chairs, and things that are common to our common senses, should have a category of existence known as being metaphysical artifacts. Okay, that there is such a thing as a table as a metaphysical artifact, and that is to say, a table is a table. It possesses tableness. And Van Inwagen, it's not that he doesn't believe tables exist. He just doesn't believe it's a new object. Okay? He believes that it's not an object. Now, since there's a common understanding, now what do I mean by common understanding? Well, now it's been a long time since I've looked at this, so I could be off, but I think this is pretty accurate. You know, David Hume, I talked very briefly about Hume's fork and how that had changed philosophy. And there's a guy came along called Thomas Reid who brought something about called common sense realism. And in a preface to a book, I read a letter from Hume, I believe, or could have been a summary of some kind. But anyway, I believe it was a letter from Hume where he said he was impressed with Thomas Reid's work and felt that it was a good explanation of things. And that may or may not have an effect on what's happening with these philosophers today, but there's a sense in which how we commonly identify things, not knowledge-wise, but the fact that the thing is there and exists says something about its nature and its existence. And it's important enough that Peter Van Inwagen thought that should be addressed in one of his arguments. And one of his arguments is called the Gollyswoggle. Well, he didn't call it the Gollyswoggle. In the book from the Manchester Lectures in Philosophy 4 calls it the Gollyswoggle argument. And that's because Van Inwagen says this. He says, well, look, let's say you have a sculpture. Okay, you have a guy, he's going to make a sculpture, and he starts manipulating the stone and chiseling away, and he would eventually make the thing. Right? But he says, let's suppose he makes an object by accident. He calls it the Gollyswoggle. And he says he makes this object by accident. And he says, maybe that object is a thing. And maybe that object is an artifact, a metaphysical artifact. Why not? Why isn't that a metaphysical artifact? So he concludes that, in fact, what you would have is an infinitesimal amount of artifacts in time. And he says you would have this sort of crowded ontology. And that's a problem distinctively for the philosophers of metaphysical artifacts, because they have to be able, they're appealing to this common sense realism, right? This common sense idea that this, if I have this right, that a table has tableness. So if you have, or a statue has statueness, right? And so what Van Inwagen's kind of undermining here is, what do you have along the way? Now, this is not to be confused with Zeno's paradox, which, if you don't know anything about that, is just to say to cross a halfway point, to get to a final point, you would have an infinite amount of halfway points. It shares some properties with that a little bit, I suppose. But what he's really getting at here is the whole concept of statue-ness, or the whole concept of what an artifact is in its essence. Why isn't these other intermediate states not also metaphysical artifacts? They're Gollyswoggles, and they could just by accident make one of these, and why doesn't it qualify as an artifact? There was intention behind it. There was, he can just name it whatever he wants, right? And it's there. Now, the proponents of, and that's what the lectures deal with, the proponents of metaphysical artifacts say, well, the issue here that Van Inwagen is struggling with, in their opinion, is intentionality, that they think that he is dismissing intentionality, that those other non-intentional states don't have to be categorized as artifacts because there's no intentionality behind them. Interesting response. Now, I'll say Van Inwagen in the back of the book has a response to that, but for time purposes and my own studies and reading, I didn't have time to go over all that. But there is a response that Van Inwagen anticipated. And if he's going to undermine their ability to say what a metaphysical artifact is, he can't deny there's something that everyone acknowledges has the properties of a table or has the properties of a chair. He can't. So what do you call that? Now, and by the way, what is? Let's hold the phone a little bit even on that. What is it if it's not a table? What does he think it is? Because it obviously exists. Now he's not. I gave you the plot twist at the beginning, right? So let's explain that. He is not saying that it's not a table. What he is saying, he's using what I'm calling, there's probably better terminology for it. I'm calling it, he uses atomic language. And with atomic language, he basically says, look, what it really is, he only believes in two actual objects, living things and atomic, principles or atomic states. And so essentially it would be that the objects come together. Now, in the beginning of his article in the second book that I showed you, Material Beings, he says, let's imagine you have a desert, okay? And the military comes in and they make a fort. What he says is that they didn't actually make a fort. They took what was already there and reshaped it. This is what I mean by atomic language. And he says they positioned the sand fort-wise. He positioned the sand fort-wise. He talks about a house and he says, there's 10,000 bricks in this house, and over time 3,000 were brought out and 3,000 more put in. That should sound familiar. And he says they were placed in housewise. I'm laughing not because I think it's stupid. I'm laughing because I just love this stuff. I love it. I think it's so interesting. And it's interesting because he's trying to keep his language consistent. All right? He's holding to this atomic language. He says something that's so fascinating. He says, language, if you look at its biological history, wasn't designed for philosophy. So he has to be very careful in the words he uses in order to, he's saying there's a little bit of clunkiness to this. And so he's being consistent in his language here. Pretty interesting. Now, the question then that I think he's anticipating is, well, if it's not a metaphysical artifact and you still identify it as something, what is it? And he calls it properly current. I'm sorry, it's properly current. Now, I'm not taking sides on this. I haven't decided yet, but I do appreciate the objections from the side that says that these are metaphysical artifacts. Because both sides agree that the common sense understanding of these things, again, I'm not talking about the epistemology, but rather the ontology. These things are there, right? They are perceived because they're there. And there's, of course, a lot of assumptions in that. Look, they're going, They both agree, both sides agree that that's important. But I'll tell you what, I'm not sitting on this chair, this couch because it's here, couch wise, right? And I'm not thinking about it that way. And the advocates of metaphysical artifacts are going, this position's here because this is the common sense understanding of these things. And they're Van Inwagen's undermining that and offering a response, but his response is one that, well, come on, let's admit it, it's a little complicated. And not the common sense understanding of these things. That doesn't make it false in and of itself, doesn't make either side false. But I do appreciate what they're both trying to do. Okay, well, I hope this made some sense. I hope that this is, it's kind of the best I can do on extremely short notice. I'm able to even get this much time in. This is part of my job, so I have to do this, and I make it sound I have to do it. I want to do it. It's just it's squeezing it in. I let the church know that I do this, and so it needs to be here and posted as frequently as I possibly can. There's so much more I wish I could say about this, and the books are full of great stuff. And the section I'm talking about, is it Munster? Yeah, the Munster Lectures. They bring up tons of arguments from the material beings text that they respond to, and it's really good. And I don't think I gave a really full, I gave just a composite of what both sides are saying, hopefully adequately, but hopefully enough to really get you something to chew on, which is really important that you use your mind that way. All right, Merry Christmas.